Hello everyone. This is fifth lecture of economic issues in public administration. From this lecture, we'll take only one day for each lecture. This means that lectures 3 and 4 are quite important for learning economics. So if you don't fully understand supply and demand theory and externalities, please repeat learning it. In this lecture, I'll cover public goods and imperfect information. These concepts of market failures are relatively new compared with monopoly and externality. In particular, public goods are quite important for public administration because public administration is about provision of public goods and services. So economists identify two conditions of good which government should provide. In other words, market cannot provide. Non-excludability creates free rider issue. If suppliers cannot charge consumers' usage of the good, self-interested consumers will choose not to pay even if they actually use the goods. As a consequence, market cannot provide non-executable goods because there is no profit incentive. Here is an example of non-executable good. Right house is non-executable because suppliers cannot identify which ship receives benefits from the right house. Another good example of non-executable good is national defense. The Department of Defense cannot identify who received benefits from their services. Also, they cannot identify how much benefit these consumers received. The second condition of good which government should provide is non-rivalry. Non-rivalry means one person's consumption does not affect another person's consumption. In other words, there is no limit of using such goods. In economic terms, the marginal cost of providing one more unit for another consumer is zero. Therefore, suppliers cannot have incentive to acquire more consumers by providing more goods. For instance, the next person has come to the US, receives the same amount of defense service. An extra person does not add national defense cost. In other words, the extra person does not affect availability of national defense service in the US. Why is public good a market failure? Because private firms cannot make profits through providing pure public goods which are non-excludable and non-rival. Please note that in economic terms, public goods don't mean goods actually provided by the government at the current time. Public goods are concepts which justify government interventions. So in theory of public goods, government should provide non-executable and non-rival goods. So when you read books of economics or when you work on your assignments, please distinguish between conceptual public goods and actual public goods which are currently provided by your government. There can be 4 classifications of goods according to non-excludability and non-rivalry because all the goods cannot meet 2 conditions together. Goods which have non-excludability and non-rivalry are called pure public goods, such as national defense and right house, while goods which have one of them are called quasi-public goods. These quasi-public goods bring more issues to argument of government interventions because according to theory of public goods, it's clear that government should provide pure public goods. On the other hand, it's difficult to judge whether government intervention is necessary for provision of these quasi-public goods. One of 2 quasi-public goods is called commons, which is libel. but non-executable. A typical example of commons is natural resources, such as ocean fishery or water resources. Specifically, an extra fisherman does not affect the number of fish in the entire ocean. On the other hand, it's quite difficult to identify who catch fishes in the entire ocean, a big ocean. Since commons are non-executable, it has free rider problems. That problem specifically is called tragedy of commons. I'll explain details in the next slide. Another quote public good is called collective goods or club goods. It's non-liable but executable. I prefer term club goods to collective goods because it represents that feature. A good example of club good is cable TV. In the case of cable TV, one person's usage of cable TV does not affect others' usage of cable TV, so it's non-liable. However, cable TV companies can charge consumers, especially when they join the cable TV network. But please note that it's relatively difficult to measure how much consumers watch that cable TV. So it's easier for the company to set the same price of using that cable TV rather than measuring the time of watching that cable TV. So in a club goods, consumers pay the fee for joining the club or network. This is a reason why this goods is called club goods. Finally, most goods in the world are private goods which are liable and executable. In other words, market can provide most goods according to theory of public goods. However, there are many cases where government provides these liable and executable goods. For instance, the US government provides the public housing for the poor or marginalized people. Housing is liable and executable. If one person occupies a house, another person cannot live in that house. Also, it is relatively clear who is living in a house or room, so we need to buy a house or rent a room. So it's executable. So these goods are provided by the government based on paternalistic perspectives. In other words, social equity rather than theory of public goods. Again, please distinguish between conceptual public goods we've just learned and goods which are actually provided by your government. In sum, we've covered 4 classifications of goods according to non-rivalry and non-executability. But please note that there is no perfect non-rivalry or perfect non-executability, so we can not clearly distinguish these 4 goods. Actually, these conditions are matter of degree, not perfect yes or no situation. We go back to a quote public good common to discuss a free rider problem. Free rider problem in commons is specifically called tragedy of the commons. This concept is quite important, especially these days, because this concept is used to discuss environment problems. In tragedy of commons, commons are natural resources. Self-interested individuals try to get benefits by using natural resources as much as possible without considering others or maybe future generations. However, natural resources are liable in the long term. self-interested people's usage of natural resources affect availability of natural resources for others or future generations. So Harding 1968 theorized that depletion of common resource is a result of self-interested action of individuals. So how to solve that tragedy has been a critical issue. One possible answer is provided by Elinor Ostrom, who is a Nobel Prize winner of economics. She suggests that communities should have regulations or rules of controlling natural resource usage. Elinor Ostrom is a public choice theorist. You'll learn what public choice theory is later. She tries to prove that interactions of self-interested individuals in a community can lead to establishment of regulations or rules which effectively control natural resource usage. This is the end of this video. We've just covered non-rivalry and non-excludability. These two conditions of goods justify that government needs to provide certain goods. In the next video, we'll study a critical issue of public goods, where government might fail to achieve efficient level of public good production. Also, we'll talk about imperfect information and some types of economic theories, classic, neoclassic, or Keynesian economics.